Okay, so we're moving right along in our studies through this book of Philippians. I think last week we took a break from that, but I want to remind you guys we entitled this whole book, the series of Philippians, "Joy Unchained," because joy is really the theme that is laced throughout this epistle, throughout this letter that Paul has written to this church. And tonight, as we head into chapter 4, and this is our last chapter, not our last study, but our last chapter, the theme is of joy. It's going to be there again. We're going to see it in full force. So, Paul, as we look through this study, I should say, look through this book, has demonstrated resolve in different ways, right? So earlier in chapter 1, you remember Paul was resolved to stay in this earth, in this life, right, rather than go to be with Jesus, right? He said, "I have the choice, but I'm for you it's better. So it's better for me, far better to go be with Jesus, but I'm going to stay with you," right? He made that decision, that choice. And then in chapter 3, he was resolved to count all that he had, all the religious life that he had, all that, his pedigree, if you will. He was resolved to count it as loss for the opportunity to know Jesus. And so in chapter 4, we're going to see, and we're going to kind of dive into Paul demonstrating resolve once again. In fact, we want to give ourselves a title for tonight. It's Joy's Resolve. So not only is Paul resolved to walk with the Lord, as we've seen all throughout this letter, but he exhorts the Philippians as well, as we as well have seen, to do the same. And so we're going to start in chapter 4, looking at the first 5 verses, verses 1 through 5. And they'll break down as follows. Verse 1, we're going to see the resolve to stand. And then verses 2 and 3, the resolve to unite. And then 4 and 5, the resolve to rejoice. So we'll just jump right in, begin with the resolve to stand. So look at verse 1 in there in Philippians chapter 4. And Paul says, "Therefore, my beloved and longed for brethren, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, beloved." Paul uses this term, therefore, regularly. It's a very important word. We talked about if you see a therefore, you have to understand what is it there for, right? So I know you're gonna. I say it. So there you go. I said that joke. Paul is incorporating, because of this therefore. He's looking back basically on all that he has written up to this point, but specifically the last few verses that just before chapter 4 verse 1 starts. He's looking back to that place where he's telling them, if you remember our last study, this place is not our home, right? We have a citizenship in heaven that awaits us. And then he also is reminding them of the fact that when we're taken home, right, we're going to be with Jesus. And not only are we going to be with Jesus, right, we're going to have glorified bodies. We're going to be with the Lord for the rest of eternity. So truly what he's trying to tell them is truth like this, truth like that those very truths should affect us, right? It should affect our perspective. It should affect how we see things or how we do things. And truly it should humble us. It should cause us to want to do what the Lord asks us to do within his word. So Paul doesn't, he speaks to them this word of encouragement, right? And I love this because Paul, he wants to give them a statement, so stand fast, and we'll get to that. But before he even gets to that, he speaks words of comfort and words of love. He cared about them. He says, "Therefore, my beloved and longed for brethren," right? You remember Paul, he longed to be with them, right? You remember he's writing this letter from prison. And you remember back, he was going to send Timothy and Epaphroditus to them. So he's reminding them, again, he's reiterating the fact that I wish it was me coming, that it wasn't just Timothy and Epaphroditus. I wish I was the one that was coming to you right now, right? You know, you are a longed for brethren. I care about you, right? And so he says, you're my joy and crown. My joy, my beloved, my joy and crown. Paul's telling these folks, he's saying that you are the source. You're one of the source of joy in my life, in this world. The fact, that you are, you are who you are. God has put you in my life. Remember, it was the very thought of them needing him to be there in his life, that he wanted to be there for him, that he made that choice to not be with the Lord, right? To stay, at least until, thus far, until God truly ultimately called him home. So Paul loved them. Paul cared for them. And just knowing that this group of believers was walking with the Lord brought joy to Paul's heart. It's not unlike Jesus, right? Hebrews 12:2 says, Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. So why did Jesus do what he did? Because when he knew, looking forward, he said, this is why, because of you, because of me. That's why Jesus did what he did. He did it for the joy of knowing that we would be sitting here just like this, studying the Word of God, that we would be coming together as a group of believers, that we would know him, we would want to follow him and serve him. That was joy to Jesus' heart. So just like that, it should be our joy, though, as well, to serve God and to serve others as well. I've shared with you before that before we came back to Scotland, we were overseeing our school of ministry at Calvary Chapel in Houston. And over those 6 years, we had the privilege of serving quite a few young adults. There were a couple of older people in there at different times, but for the most part, it was young adults, and we loved each one of them. And, when they would fail or they would stumble, because they did, people do, right? Our hearts were broken, right? But at the same time, when they grew and they started to continue and serve the Lord, and God started using them in mighty ways, and our hearts, Angela would testify as well, our hearts were overjoyed. It was a blessing to us. They really were, in a lot of ways, like our kids, right? We saw them grow in the Lord, and for us to see them being used by God was like, it made us so proud, if you can say that without being sinful. But for Paul, it's the same, right? Seeing these people grow brought joy to his heart. Now, I would hope and I would pray that all of us would have the opportunity to pour into somebody else's life in such a way that you see God using them, you see them grow, that you see that your efforts are effective, right? And then you see it pay off. They're serving the Lord, they're growing in the Lord. So that's a joy, right, to be able to do that, to serve like that. Now, Paul also says, my joy and crown, good word. He's telling them basically, you're my reward, right? And of course, when he says crown, he's not talking about a king's crown, like some sort of a, royalty. He's actually referring to, in those days, they had the Olympic Games and you had Isthmus Games, you had various competitions, and instead of a medal, like we have the gold and silver and bronze, they would get the laurel wreath that would go around their head. So that's the crown he's actually referring to. And so they would place that laurel wreath on the winner's head, right? Paul is basically saying that no matter what rewards, we were talking about rewards in weeks past. We were just after the study and the conversation. Paul's basically saying no matter what rewards are awaiting, really, you're my reward. The people, you've given your life to the Lord and you're walking in strength and walking with the Lord. You're my reward. Knowing the fact that when I stand before the Lord and we're all there, you're going to be there with me. That's joy. That's reward enough in and of itself for Paul. And so he's telling them, this is who you are. I love you so much. And then Paul makes that statement. He says, so stand fast in the Lord. Now, I like to focus on words because I think they're important. The word so. Most people would just go, that's a meaningless little word. That's just like a passing on to something more important type of word. Not so with this word. So, it actually means in like manner or in this fashion, right? Paul is pointing back to the fact that we have so much awaiting us. Heaven, right? Glorified bodies. We're going to be made like Jesus. That's what, not even just glorified bodies, but we're going to be like Jesus. And we're going to be with the Lord as his bride, the bridegroom, for all eternity, right? He's saying in this fashion, understanding this, knowing what that is all about, having that mindset, stand fast in the Lord. That's very important. The phrase stand fast actually means to persevere, to keep going. We kind of think stand is something like you're doing, like you're stationary, you're not going anywhere. It's not necessarily that. It just means don't be moved backwards or to the side, to the left, to the right. Just keep going forward, keep moving, persevere. But it's good because he says in the Lord. That's very important. We could try to stand fast in our own strength. I'm going to stand fast, but it's only in the Lord. That's the only way. Only in Jesus can we stand fast. Can we persevere? I think of John chapter 15. In John chapter 15, right, Jesus, the famous statement where he says, I am the vine. In John chapter 15, verse 4, he adds, when he's talking about being the vine, Jesus says, abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. So there are so many things in this life that are seeking to derail us, seeking to get us off track, right? Get us to stop or to go back, and keep us from moving forward in this context to stand fast. The only way we're able to stand or to move even forward in any capacity is if we remain abiding in Jesus. So that means remain abiding in prayer. These are simple things. I love how the Lord gives us a relationship with him, and he gives us very simple, instructions or simple ways that we are to abide in him. We're to stay in abiding in prayer. We're to stay abiding in his word. We're to stay in fellowship. We're to stay involved in serving and doing different things for him as he opens up those opportunities. So Paul's saying, in this manner, stand fast, right, in the Lord. And then he adds, beloved. So 3 times Paul expresses his love for the Philippian church. I think that's great. His heart is that they would resolve to stand fast, that they would have this mindset to keep moving forward, right? We read that before in Philippians. I don't look back, I press forward. But standing fast means keep persevering. Don't give up. Resolve to stand fast. And then, so that brings us to our next point. We see resolve to stand. How about resolve to unite? Because Paul then moves on to address a conflict, a division, if you will, but that he was obviously aware of. And verse 2, you look at verse 2, he says, I implore, and I'm going to say these names the way I say them, so if you say them a different way, we can talk about that later, but I'll say, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Now, Paul calls out these 2 ladies in the church. Now, I have to admit, the first time, way back when I first was an early Christian, young Christian, and I read this, I thought, does Paul always do that? Like, is that like his norm? Is that like the normal thing? Like, are we supposed to call people out in publicly, And I was like, imagine you're Euodia and Syntyche, that your name is now forever linked with this conflict that you had, and it was written right there, and everybody's passing the letter around, and all of a sudden becomes canon of Scripture, they're probably going, when we get to heaven, we're going to talk to Yodia and Syntyche. Did they ever work it out? But obviously, that's not necessarily the case. Paul's not like normally call people out. There is a reason. There's a reason why, and you can actually understand to some degree why in the next verse. So let's go ahead and read that. He says, I urge you also, true companion, and we'll get back to that phrase, but he says, help these women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. So these two women were not just any two women in the church. It doesn't really tell us a whole lot about them, but we can obviously see from that context that they were somebody important. They were there from the beginning of the church. And whether they had position or not, they had some sort of status within the church. And Paul knew that their conflict, if not resolved, would lead to even more disruption, more division within the church. And so that helps us to understand. That's why it's so important that if someone is a leader, right? Just like these women were in some sort of leadership capacity, they're held to an even higher standard, right? So Paul felt it was important enough to actually name these women in this letter because it's going to affect the whole church, and he had to deal with it in a higher kind of way, more visible way. But any division in the church is not good. Of course, we know that. The Bible tells us that God actually hates. There's 6 things that God hates, 7 things that he despises. One of them is one who sows discord or division amongst the brethren. Man, I never want to be on the hate side of God's hatred, on the receiving side of God's hatred. But these women, obviously there was an important thing. So it's important to understand it's not good to have division, but especially amongst the leadership of a church. Very important to have unity and no division. Because that kind of division, that leads to real problems, real strife in the church, as well as even church splits and real big issues. And the truth is, people, as we've talked about in previous studies, people, just like these Philippians, were looking to their leaders, right? To those who were mature. We talked about that, right? Those that would call themselves or see themselves as mature, to set the example. So these two women were meant to be those kind of examples. They were meant to be, two women that they can look up to, but they were obviously having a conflict. And so he's saying, we have to deal with this. And he exhorts those that are also mature. If these ladies can't get it together, then they're to step up and to help them, right? Help them resolve, this issue. And they can't allow this issue to fester, to become a problem. And he's basically telling them, come on, ladies, get this resolved. He says, be of the same mind. He's exhorting them to be of the same mind. We've seen this phrase quite a few times already in Philippians, be of the same mind. And it means to be harmonious. It means to cherish the same things. Start thinking the same way. And I appreciate Paul because he uses the term implore. But he doesn't just say, I implore Euodia and Syntyche, as if to emphasize maybe Euodia more over the other one, or vice versa. He says, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche. So he makes them equal in responsibility in this division or in this conflict. And then he even lists others, as I've said just earlier, others to come alongside. Now, he's basically saying if these two can't figure it out, then others that are as mature or in the same situation as them, come alongside of them and fix it. And he actually specifically, if you read the context, he specifically calls out a specific person to spearhead this conflict resolution. He says, I urge you also, true companion, help these women. So we're not told who the specific person is, and he's writing to a group, but then all of a sudden, right at this very moment, he kind of decides, I'm going to pinpoint. So I'm only guessing, but this idea, the phrase true companion, somebody there must know, okay, I know who he's talking to. He's talking to me, because that's what he used to always call me, or that was a phrase he used for me. So he's calling out this one person, but really it's for all other mature believers as well. And it had to be done. It's a biblical approach, right? It's a biblical approach to help others to bring resolution or resolve conflicts. But all too often, we see, I know I've seen it so many times in the church, when you have problems or there's conflict or situations where two people are kind of butting heads, we tend to shy away. We sweep it under the carpet and ignore it, altogether. And we can't afford to do that. See, Satan, we need to understand, Satan and his forces, they're looking. They're looking for any opportunity. Look out to exploit, situations to exploit. Anything they can do to create strife, anything they can do to ultimately bring division, and bring division especially within the leadership of the church. We used to have a saying in our leadership that leadership always backs leadership. So you'll have conflicts within the body, and they'll come up and make an accusation against the leader, and that phrase is really meaning to say, initially, to that person, you want to back that leader. And so if someone says, hey, Alan, I know Alan's doing this or that, and I would say, well, I know Alan. Alan loves the Lord. Alan is faithful to serve the Lord. And so there must be a misunderstanding. You need to talk to Alan, but I know Alan, And then maybe I go to Alan separately, privately, and I talk to Alan and say, what's going on? Is there a situation here? This person, maybe you need to go and talk to that person and work it out. But I don't allow that to create more, like I'm on their side. That now there's more division that's being created. So that's a principle of leadership that we've been taught, and I try to hold to. But all too often when there's a conflict, instead of trying to resolve it, we either ignore it, we just say, I'm not going to talk to that person anymore. That we just chalk them up to like, well, I don't really like them anyway, and I don't need to talk to them. By not talking to them, it's no skin off my nose. I'm just, Or a lot of people do this. They just go to another church. They just stop coming, and that's just terrible. It's wrong, right? It's a shame, and it's totally unbiblical, because we're called to bring peace, right? We're called to try to bring peace. It says, blessed are the peacemakers. That's what Jesus said in the Beatitudes. And now I know that sometimes it's not always possible. So sometimes the other person just doesn't want to, make peace. They're going to hold. You can't force somebody else, to do something. But Romans 12:18 says, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, right? Live peaceably with all men. So, and it's not just men. So, it doesn't mean if it's a woman, you cannot live peaceably. Of course, we understand that. But it's the idea that if it depends on us, we're to try, we're to strive. As Ephesians 4:3 says, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And Paul even says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, there's times when our division even gets worse, because it tells us that there's a point with the Corinthians that people were taking their brothers to court, right? So they had some kind of business deal going on, or some kind of thing was going on, and something went awry. And because of that, they just said, well, I'm taking them to court. And he's like, that shouldn't be, right? He says, you're going to be judging angels. You guys can't resolve these issues just within the church, within yourselves, but you take it before the world, and you're showing them what we are. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 7, Paul says, why not accept wrong even if you're not wrong, accept wrong. That's like a concept like nobody ever, are willing to accept, willing to do. And he even says, or why not even let yourself be cheated? Whew. Somebody embezzles money from you or takes something from you or lies about you. Or, you know what? Paul's saying rather than take it to that extent, go to court and take it before the world, Christian against Christian, before this worldly magistrate, just let yourself be cheated. That's Paul's like saying, you know what? Listen, it's more important to strive and to seek after unity than it is to be right. It's more important. And besides, it all belongs to God anyway, right? It all belongs to God. God, he'll be your defender. That's what he's described out through the book of Psalms. He's described as the high tower, right? Our defense, our refuge. He'll defend us. He'll take care of us. He'll provide for us. And so Paul is saying, strive for this, endeavor to have this kind of mindset. Ladies, get this together. And then he says of these women and of Clement and others that worked with him in the gospel, their names are written in the book of life. Now, as a side note, interesting, the book of life, other than Revelation, which is mentioned 7 times in the book of Revelation, this is the only other time outside of Revelation that it's actually mentioned. The book of life is where all the names of those who have given their life to Jesus Christ, or and that's something like that, are written in, supposedly, right? So there are a couple of places in Psalm 69 as well as Exodus 32 where they mention a book, but most scholars believe that's just poetic wording, not necessarily referring to specifically the book of life mentioned here in Philippians as well as Revelation. So, but then, Paul is basically telling them, look, you shouldn't be arguing. You shouldn't be dividing. We're all going to be in glory with Jesus anyway. So it's more important. What's more important than knowing and following the Lord and being in unity than some petty differences that we might have in this life? The same goes for us. When we stand before Jesus, I guarantee, and I can say this, I believe without a doubt, all the petty squabbles that we've allowed to fester or ferment, or all the grudges we might have, are going to seem quite foolish when we stand before Jesus and we understand who he is and his grace and all that he has for us. So why, Paul's basically saying to us as well as to the Philippians, why allow those things to divide us now? Right? Just let it go. Give it to them. Try to work it out, but just if worse comes to worse, just let yourself be defrauded. And even worse than how it affects us, you or me, and this other person or this other situation, how does it affect our effectiveness in the world? Right? That's really what it comes down to. John 13:25, he says, by all this, by this all will know that you're my disciples, by your love for one another. So when they look at us and they go, oh, that's what the Christians are like, that's what being a Christian is, when they see us all divided and have conflict, holding grudges, and so on and so forth. See, our unity, we've talked about it several times throughout this letter, it's a critical element of our witness to the Lord. So Paul is resolved, if you will, to resolve this conflict. And he wants them to do it, and he wants us to do it as well. So that brings us to our verse 4 and 5, and that's resolved to rejoice. And Paul states this with emphasis. He says in verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. That word rejoice, we've seen it actually several times throughout the book of Philippians. It's a quiet confidence, right? And he emphasizes it because he just doesn't say it at the beginning of the sentence. He says it at the end. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I will say rejoice. He's emphasizing it. And Paul's heart is saying, rather than focus on the small issues that lead to division, focus on the Lord. Focus on rejoicing in the Lord. Remind yourself every day and in every situation that you're his, right? That you have salvation and you have heaven awaiting you, right? So there's nothing in this world, no matter how bad it can be, that is really compares to what we already have in glory waiting us. And he says, rejoice in the Lord always, right? So joy, this joy, this quiet confidence in the Lord, this trusting in his promise, and ultimately placing our hope in what awaits us should be one of the main characteristics that we as believers exemplify. Charles Spurgeon once said, "What a gracious God we serve, who makes delight to be a duty, and who commands us to rejoice. Should we not at once be obedient to such a command as this?" And he says, it is intended that we should be happy. And I'm assuming it's not happy like as in just happy over our circumstances or happenstance. He's talking about being blessed, having joy, having that true joy. See, God has our best in mind. Even in the midst of hardships or trials, right? I think of what's been going on with our friends and our family in Houston, all that they've been dealing with over this last week. And it's been really awesome and encouraging to see all through on Facebook. You see they're mucking out their houses, and they're all, you look at the front of on the front yard, and they're just all this stuff, and it's a lot of work, and I'm sure it probably smells because it's all wet and everything, and this is their whole life, right? This is their home. All their possessions are just being dumped on the front, lawn, and yet so many. I'm just watching them. They're videotaping, and they're just so full of joy. They're just thankful that God would just give them a chance again to be able to build or rebuild or have a life. Just to be able to be alive. And it's so encouraging, right? They have joy even in the midst of trials. In fact, that kind of joy in the midst of trials. So imagine you're on this block and it's like 20, 30 homes on this one street, both sides, doing the exact same thing. And you're the believer and everybody else is doing the exact same thing, but they're filled with stress. They're filled with worry. They're filled with anxiety because they don't know what the future is going to hold. And here you are, you're a believer, and you're doing this with joy. You got people that are there with you, and they're just loving each other, and they're like, whoa, what is that? That's one of the main tools in the midst of trials that God uses to reach, to speak to a fallen world. We have to understand that. That's why we are allowed to go through those kinds of trials. Why, as believers, why doesn't God just give us all blessings and just happy days and rosy, walkways? Why doesn't he just do that? Because he knows that other people need to see our joy in the midst of trials. And then he also says, right, let your gentleness be known to all men. In verse 5, the word gentleness means suitable, fair, or equitable. I like that word, right? It's the idea that we as believers should not be led with our emotions or what we think is right? We should be dealing with situations fairly, rationally, right? Aiming to bring peace to the situation rather than just seeking to be right. I appreciate it, and I've mentioned this before. James 3:17, when it speaks of God's wisdom, it says this, and I've read this before, but I think it's worth reading again. But it says, but the wisdom that is from above, here are some good qualities that God's wisdom is. It says, first, pure, and then peaceable, right? Peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy, good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. I love those adjectives, those descriptions: peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy. That's not God trying to say, you get your own way. If you're right, and stand up for your rights and be right, and no matter what, No, he's saying, look, at my wisdom is saying, you know what? It's okay. It's all right. If you think that, if you're going to do that, right? I said it before and I'll say it again. God is much less concerned about winning an argument as he is about winning a soul. Winning a soul. So whether it's dealing with conflict or just dealing with people in general, just dealing with different types of personalities, the scriptures are full of instructions on our attitude, the attitude we should be displaying when we're dealing with others. I'll just read a few of them. Philippians 2:3. We've already actually covered this, right? Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind. Let each esteem others better than himself. 2 Timothy 2:25, it says, in humility correcting those who are in opposition, if God perhaps will grant them repentance so that they might know the truth. Titus 3:2, to speak evil of no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing all humility to all men, right? So we are to reflect the gentleness of God, the gentleness of who God is, God himself, right? Romans 2:4, it tells us that it's the goodness of God that leads us to repentance, that leads you to repentance. That goodness or that kindness, that love, that grace, that gentleness. So we'll never win an argument by sheer force. Never. Someone may acquiesce to your position outwardly, but I would say this, you haven't reached their heart, not by a long shot, right? Proverbs 15:1, soft answer turns away wrath. That reflects the very heart or the very character of God. And then Paul finishes that verse with, the Lord is at hand, right? In other words, he's reminding them, Jesus, listen, guys, get your act together, come together, get back to unity, start understanding it's about rejoicing in the Lord. Why rejoicing? Because Jesus could come back at any moment. He's at hand. He could come back. And I was thinking, he's thinking to them, do you really want to have him find you holding a grudge, right? Or holding on to some bitterness over something that really when we get to heaven won't even matter. Won't even matter. We'll be with the Lord for eternity. I say it all the time, perspective is everything, right? When we have this kind of perspective, when we have this kind of idea, this mindset, right? It changes everything. It should change the way we act. The key to resolve these kinds of issues, or the key, I should say, for us is to resolve to have this kind of mindset, right? Now, we'll actually talk about in the next study this kind of mindset, what it means to have that kind of thinking, that kind of, as we move further along. But it begins with us to have this resolve, to follow what the scriptures say. And, as we said from the beginning in this book, we're to resolve to let the life of Jesus live through us, right? For me to live is Christ. That's what Paul said. We're to have that same idea, that same mindset. Again, Philippians 1:6, he will complete the work. Our job is to let him do it, right? Our job is just to be willing to allow him to do that, to have that resolve, to let God do that work and have the right mindset. So I hope we do that. That's my prayer for myself, because I know that I'm not always perfect and live like that. So I pray that for myself as well as for all of us here. So let's go ahead and pray.